Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you are. I am Lisa Berkeley, and this is a reaction to response, a webinar series that was designed to give people the opportunity to hear from thought leaders who are helping us shift from fear-based reactions to care and compassionate-based responses. We were birthed through the Charter for Compassion Women and Girls sector, and we're in over 400 cities with 1,800 partners in 53 countries and divided into 12 sectors. You can learn more about us at thecharterforcompassion.org. Before we get into today's call, there's a little bit of housekeeping we need to do. First, this call is being recorded. Second, if you have any tech issues, you can go to zoom.us and they can help you. And if you have any questions or comments for the speaker or other comments during the call today, you can hover at the bottom of your screen for those who are watching with us live and find the question and answer box. And of course, there's also the chat section as well. I also want to take a minute to thank everyone who's working behind the scenes for us: Sandy Hart, Brianna Lathrop, Susan DeGaia, and Betsy Spano. Today's guest is Roshi Joan Halifax. She's a Buddhist teacher and a Zen priest, anthropologist, and pioneer in the field of end-of-life care. Among many other things, she is also founder of the Upaya Zen Center. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce her. I also want to just do a little bit of further house cleaning here, which is that unfortunately yesterday, Roshi Joan's center, the Upaya Zen Center, had a fire. And so we're going to be doing a little shorter version of what we normally do today. And actually, before we begin, if we can just take a minute of silence, just to sort of bring everyone into this space here and hold a space of transformation and well-being for Roshi Joan and all of her community, and that everyone be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, and hello, Roshi Joan.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being with us.
So, Lisa, I just want to clarify. The Upaya Zen Center is fine.
Oh, okay.
It's our retreat place in the mountains.
Oh, okay.
And so, and fortunately, no one was killed, and the fire destroyed buildings, but it was contained sufficiently so the forest, which we're surrounded by 3 million acres of national forest. So, so it was a long day yesterday. So that's where that is. So thank you for that moment of silence.
Great. So today's topic is going to be honoring the grieving spirit, living with grief and cultivating compassion. And part of what today's topic also is about is just acknowledging that we're moving into the winter solstice, the darkest part of the night right before the light comes, and really how that affects us internally. And for those who don't know, but you know, obviously, I've had the great honor to have an advanced copy of your book, Living on the Edge, which brilliantly speaks to this interstice between light and dark, or suffering and freedom and all of that. And before we get into the real substance of your work, if we can also just take a minute and look a little bit at the 17 UN Sustainability Goals, which are about to be on the screen. There we go. And sort of talk a little bit how shifting into a place of compassion for grief, or doing this work on the edge, which we're going to discuss in a minute, touches on these goals.
You know, this book, which is going to be out in the beginning of May, is about the strength that we can manifest when we stand on the high edge of certain human virtues with the capacity to include not only the positive side of those capacities, but also the landscape associated with the challenges that we encounter, for example, in loss, or for example, in bearing witness to poverty and homelessness and hunger, or bearing witness to people who are gravely ill, who are facing death, or understanding what it is to live in a world where education is either biased or non-existent altogether. Or living in a world where there's no gender parity, where there is gender violence, abuse, egregious harm against women, against those who are more subject to predation. And, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals are really, from my point of view, a vision of compassion that can be actualized through the medium of our experience in the world of altruism, of empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement, which are the 5 domains that I address in my new book, Standing at the Edge. And my basic contention is that the shadow elements of those deep human qualities, essential human qualities, the shadow aspects of those human qualities are transformed through the medium of us actualizing compassion.
Right on. So you actually touched onto something that we also talk about here as well. And during one of our previous webinars, Sandy Hart, the director of Women and Girls, made an excellent point that we really need an 18th sustainability goal, which is self-awareness and personal agency.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that's really kind of where we start off. And I think that's also the perfect jumping ground to go now to come back and switch more deeply into our conversation with you about your work. So you mentioned the 5 qualities of altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement. And you also just now even mentioned the shadow side of them. And so I was thinking perhaps we can sort of do a little bit of dance and kind of address each one. I know that each one we could have a whole seminar for probably a year on each of these topics. But before we begin, because we're talking about engaging of compassion, let's get a little bit more clear too about what is compassion, and for you, again, a whole other topic forever. But what is it for you, and how do you need compassion?
You know, I think compassion has often been conflated with empathy. And empathy is a very important human capacity. In fact, a world without empathy is a world where we are dead to each other. But compassion often incorporates empathy within the suite of qualities that is compassion. But compassion entails a tremendous attentional balance where we can literally attend, perceive, bear witness to, presence the suffering of others. It also brings forward the quality of care, of prosociality, of tenderness, of concern. That is really important. Empathy does not always involve concern. In fact, sometimes it's about self-concern, or certain kinds of empathy are more manipulative. For example, people who are predators can sense into, be empathic with, resonate with people who are, the subject of their predation. But we're speaking specifically about this capacity to feel concern for others. And then another aspect of compassion that is really important is our deep aspiration to transform the experience, or to see transformed the experience of the suffering of another, or of a landscape, or of an entire nation. But we have to have this aspiration for the transformation of suffering. And then the fourth quality that I think is really important is that we have the aspiration to actually take action. Even if we can't take action, we wish the best for as an outcome for a person who's gravely suffering. So it's one way of looking at compassion: the capacity to presence, the sense of concern for the well-being of others. The third is the aspiration to transform the suffering of another. And the fourth is to actually engage directly or indirectly in an action that will help others. But there are other ways that we can look at compassion, but maybe that's enough of an answer for right now.
Well, you just reminded me, when you're talking about empathy, I had this sort of aha moment, if you will. You said that compassion fatigue is not really compassion fatigue, and that it's empathic distress.
Yes.
That in fact, compassion does not fatigue us. I have a quote here in front of me from your book. Compassion does not fatigue us. It's a source for strength, and supports our strength, and supports our thriving, and benefits others. And that was a big wow. I very much appreciated that distinction, because I think, to your point, so many people get that confused.
Fundamentally, there, as I said, been confusion around what compassion is, and conflating it with empathy. And it's not to say that empathy is all problematic. Hardly. As I said, a world without empathy is a world where we are really dead to each other. Being able to sense or include the experience of others into our subjectivity is really important. At the same time, the experience of empathic over-arousal and empathic distress is something that many people go through, where they experience what's called vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. Just being around suffering can waste people. And
it was the first time I'd ever heard empathy being broken down into three categories of somatic empathy, emotional empathy, and cognitive empathy. That was a new, again, another aspect of the aha moment. And when you talk about like a predator being able to empathize with their potential victim, like that's a powerful way of defining empathy.
Well, I think, all of this is seen on a spectrum. So, for example, somatic empathy, a mother being able to sense into or include her infant so deeply into her own experience that she knows when the baby is hungry. Or a nurse being able to turn a patient so sensitively so as not to cause distress to a patient. So, that's somatic empathy, where we are really fusing with the physical experience of another. And some people have that to a very high degree. It's fairly rare, but it's still very interesting. And then some people are quite blunted. They really don't feel anything when others are harmed, at the physical level. And then emotional empathy, of course, is being able to include the person's emotional or affective experience. And this is something many therapists, human rights workers, journalists, lawyers, really able to bring the experience of those whom they're serving into their own experience. And again, if we don't know how to or are not able to regulate our experience, we can be overwhelmed by the suffering of others.
Mm-hmm. So
And then cognitive empathy, which is, also called mind reading or perspective taking. And, it's being able to sort of see how the other sees the world, kind of their theory of mind.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I cut you off. Were you going to say more about that?
No, that's probably enough.
Okay.
They should read the book.
Oh, it's a phenomenal book. I so loved it. And I'm in the midst of working on PhD, so reading your book was a huge, refreshing and empowering experience. So can't speak highly enough of it. Anyway.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have a question from Marianne Boyle who says, is compassion always in response to a negative state?
Not at all. I think that in rare instances, but not in general, we can say that compassion arises in the experience of, for example, sympathetic joy.
Mm-hmm.
You could say that when something good happens to someone else and, they're experiencing joy, we experience joy, but joy is a kind of benefit to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's a kind of, it's a sort of slight turn
mm-hmm.
or an interesting perspective on compassion. But compassion is primarily associated with concern and our encounter with suffering and the aspiration to transform suffering.
Right. So to go back then with compassion, so when people are trying to work from a place of compassion, very often it comes from an altruistic place. And I so appreciated some of what you were talking about the three tenets of altruism. And I thought perhaps you can share a little bit of that, but maybe we should, before getting into that, address the altruism in its positive sense, but also when one crosses into the edge and it becomes its opposite, pathological altruism.
Yeah. So just, what I've said in the new book is altruism can turn into pathological altruism. And this is selfless actions in service to others are essential for our well-being. Actually, you and I wouldn't be alive. None of our listeners would be alive, save for the altruism of our parents, of those who are our caregivers when we were infants. That's a kind of selfless altruism that just naturally arises for most people. It's not, you can't say 100% because many children are harmed in this world and neglected. Mm-hmm. But anyway, selfless actions in service to others are essential to the well-being of society and the natural world. But sometimes our seemingly altruistic acts actually harm us, harm others, and if we're working inside of an institution, can harm the institution that we're serving in, and can harm the very people that we're actually endeavoring to serve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So you also then mention again, like through the lens of altruism bias, which I think is also a relevant topic for when we're trying to help people shift from really challenging times to finding a sense of balance. And can you talk a little bit about altruism bias for a
Yeah. Well, fortunately, we have altruism bias, but sometimes it's exclusionary. Mm-hmm. So, altruism bias makes it possible for us to, for example, give more attention and care to our children, or give more attention and care to our in-group, mm-hmm. And to our neighbors, to the people in our own ethnic group, mm-hmm. to people just in our country and not in other countries. And that's when altruism bias plays against us and others. That one of the stories that I tell in the book is about a young man who had a seizure and fell into the New York subway tracks. And there was an oncoming subway, and an Afro-American man whose two kids were standing with him, two little girls standing with him, just leapt off of the platform and tried to save the young man, but realized that the train was coming too quickly, and he laid on top of the young man as he was having the young man was having a seizure, and the train passed over both of their bodies, and neither were killed. So, this is, one is a white film student, and the other is, a person of another race, and obviously not as privileged. But the Mr. Autry, which is his name, Wesley Autry, had no thought. It just was spontaneously arising when he saved Mr. Holopeter's life. And so, there was no bias operating in Mr. Autry's heart at that point. He just saw another human being who was at risk. And he just, was moved. He wasn't thinking, oh, this will make me a good person, or the New York Times is going to interview me, or this is a person of relative privilege, and I don't really care about that. He just leapt and saved that young man's life.
And to your point, and I forget where exactly in the book it is, but it's something that you mentioned, is just how many acts of goodness, and you've got so many examples of people just really doing good, and not, in the world that we live in, so often it doesn't get really seen or appreciated. It's almost like we take it for granted on some level, and focus more on the negative. And I, it raises kind of a question too, for part of what today's topic is a little bit, as far as there's so much pain in the world right now. And so
we also have a negativity bias, not just an altruism bias. So the negativity bias is, we are attracted to catastrophic news. And I love Rebecca Solnit's book. Rebecca, I was so grateful, wrote the introduction to my book. Rebecca wrote an extraordinary book called Hope in the Dark about this very subject. How not so much about negativity bias, but how many extraordinary, both big and very subtle acts every day are percolating out of the ground of our common suffering.
Yeah, and it's important. This is, I think, really the big shift that most of us are trying to do, is how to help shift from the negative bias to the positive bias. And one of the things that this particularly reminds me of is you talk about the 3 tenets of altruism. And I think that they're very, very powerful for just being in a present moment when you're suffering or feeling pain, or even just being and feeling not grounded enough. Can we talk a little bit about those?
Yeah. I just before you and I met, I was speaking with my very wonderful friend and teacher, Roshi Bernie Glassman. And he and his late wife, Jishu Angyu Holmes, crafted the 3 tenets, and really coming out of their work in social action. And those tenets have been a deep support for me in the work that I've done with dying people, and also the work that I've done in Nepal, in these remote communities, and in the prison system. And they're a little bit counter to what we, many of us as Westerners, feel comfortable with. But I think they're important for us to explore. And the first tenet is of not knowing. And that is this capacity to have a kind of beginner's mind, or openness, or not to be operating out of our biases, but to really approach the world and to let the world meet us in a way that is not compromised by our expectations or our fears. And so resting in what Suzuki Roshi called beginner's mind. I love Robert Thurman, who translated the Vimalakirti Sutta, and had a way of characterizing this. Vimalakirti did, but this is Thurman's translation. He called it a tolerance for the inconceivable, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, so many times when I've walked into the room of a dying person, I've walked in with a kind of expectation or a plan in place. And I've learned to pull back that kind of conceptual approach, because I realize I'm looking for something that's secure instead of opening to a kind of making uncertainty, if you will, an ally.
Mm-hmm.
So that first tenet is very important in our world because we use certainty as a way to make ourselves feel substantial and secure.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, you know, it never works out as we had planned. So that's the first tenet. And then the second tenet is of bearing witness. And this does not mean being a bystander at all. Bearing witness is really becoming one with the truth of whatever we are bearing witness to, whether it's characterized by suffering or by joy. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of radical inclusivity. So that's the second.
Before you go on to the third, when you were talking in the book, you talk about bearing witness, and you shared this story that so touched my heart about Rita, the homeless woman. And you concluded with saying intimacy without enough time to process it might contribute to suffering. That's a really powerful statement. Would you mind sharing that story and that experience with us?
Yeah, so I was in San Francisco and was due to go to a meeting or talk. I don't quite remember which. And I had on my Roxu. I was dressed in my usual black samoy that I wear in the world. And I came out of this hotel. It wasn't a 5-star. It was probably a 3-star hotel. Mm-hmm. And I came out of the hotel, and there were a lot of people, and I was standing in line for a taxi. And an older woman, very, very tiny, with a kind of baggy shirt hanging down just above her knees, and just an old pair of shoes on, and little else. It was raining. Walked up to me and said something like, you must be a good person, or you're standing in line, you must be a good person. And at Upaya Zen Center, where I teach, there's a very important initiative we have in working with the homeless community here and in other cities around the country. And I think it's a very powerful initiative that has, from our work, really come out of the work done by my teacher, Roshi Bernie Glassman. And so I just took a moment with this woman, and instead of kind of pushing past her, even though the cab was waiting for me, I just took a moment and rested with her. And I just said, thank you. And she asked if I were a nun, and I said, well, yes, but kind of. And then she said, I want money. And I don't ever travel with money. And so there was a kind of moment, and I said I didn't have any. And she broke down into cries and shouts. And it was a very kind of startling moment. And, in my own experience with her, the category of homeless person or little or vulnerable or unsheltered, these categories had dropped away, and I just kind of opened to her, just sort of very complete in that moment. And then suddenly there was this, oops, let's see if that's, I don't know, this might be on my...
Do you need to To take something?
I don't have to take anything.
Oh, okay.
But I don't know. I couldn't turn it off, so.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, sorry. Always there are interruptions. So anyway, the doorman came up and said, Rita, you can go now, or something like that. And and I got into the cab, and it was just I had this very, really uncomfortable feeling that the way I had connected with her was so kind of innocent and open that I had somehow dissolved not only the barriers between us, but in a way, the barrier between herself and herself had also dissolved. And she was just completely vulnerable and undefended before me. And one thing I was grateful that the doorman was very kind to her. I mean, it wasn't like the police were arriving. He just sort of helped her move away from my close proximity. And what I realized, when I reflected upon that encounter, was that that kind of intimacy is a great blessing most of the time. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But sometimes being more boundaried is what is going to serve. Mm-hmm. And I realized that, that was an important lesson for me. It's not that I want to separate people, but it was more that it's important to recognize the vulnerability of others and go slowly.
That's so important, because I was so touched by that story, again, in this context of being in a situation where you're holding a space of not knowing and then bearing witness, because part of what you're talking about is also knowing your own boundaries and space and understanding that. So before going on to the third tenet of compassionate action, is there more that you wanted to say about bearing witness before I went into the story?
Yeah. Well, I learned about bearing witness in the context of the retreats that Roshi Bernie Glassman held at Auschwitz when I went in the early 90s or the mid 90s and joined those retreats. And that experience of intimacy, of bearing witness, of not separating yourself excuse me, from the truth of suffering was transformative. Not being a bystander, but allowing yourself to be infused by a multi-leveled or multiple layered reality where the sense of commitment to transforming the suffering of others, that is the commitment to compassion, is potentialized. Mm-hmm. And that's what I experienced in Auschwitz. It's one of the reasons why we're doing work with the Rohingya refugees in Kathmandu. This is another group that has been subjected to genocide. And so when we were able to discover that there were a group of Rohingya refugees living in a kind of crack in the landscape of Kathmandu, just wanting to serve that community in whatever way possible, knowing how deep the trauma has been for those people who've escaped Myanmar. Mm-hmm. That, the ethnic cleansing and the genocide in Myanmar are very close to what has happened to other populations, including Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, Tibetans, and so on.
Yeah, pretty much anybody. Well, of so many people. So you talk then about the third tenet of compassionate action, which you also just alluded to in the work that you're doing as well. But can you elaborate a little bit more?
So compassionate action is really born of or coming out of not knowing, of this kind of openness, and also from our capacity to not separate from the truth of the suffering of others or the experience of others. And that it is, coming from insight or deep discernment into what will serve, and a kind of motivation that is unselfish. So compassionate action sometimes means refraining, doing nothing. And sometimes compassionate action is involved, like Wesley Autry, and just it's spontaneously arising, where, he leaps into, the oncoming, the subway that is racing toward this young man having a seizure, or the young men who were killed on the train in Oregon, defending the young Islamic girls. So, it's not that you sit around and bear witness, just kind of fiddling around and figuring it out, or just sit there ignorantly and not knowing. But what the three tenets do, particularly the direct and conscientious practice of the first two tenets, it provides the foundation where our experience of openness and non-separation becomes, embedded in ourselves, in our nervous system. And so when compassion arises, it's not mediated or filtered. It's spontaneously arising.
And when you talk about that edge, right, of the positive versus the negative, how do the three tenets help one discern so that it stays in the positive realm and doesn't shift into the more negative? And you give the examples in the book, but yeah.
Well, actually, I use the three tenets in this book as practices. Shifting out of not knowing into being an expert. You can feel it in the body. All of a sudden, you come from this kind of boorish knowingness, and you have this kind of pseudo confidence, and that begins to erode your capacity to really be open, because you're looking for something secure. And the same with bearing witness. Bearing witness, you could say the downside of bearing witness is that of being a bystander, of just taking a completely dissociated, dispassionate position. And then all of, the Congo, people in the Congo are being harmed. You walk into the prison system and there's no compassion. It's just people are dissociated and there's egregious harm and so on and so forth. So you don't want that. You want there to be connection and also sensation, but also regulation as you're experiencing or not separating from the experience of others, presencing, in other words. Being able to really presence the truth of suffering. And then, of course, compassionate action. The downside of compassionate action is, of learning when idiot compassion is arising. When you're doing this out of an ego trip, or your intolerance for the suffering that you're experiencing and bearing witness to others, and so on and so forth. I mean, read the book, as I say.
Yeah.
There's a lot in it.
A huge amount in there. So I just related to that. And when we talk about the chaos of the world and how people can keep themselves from getting pulled into all of the suffering, I think to your point about compassion action and feeling it in the body is really, really accurate. And there, if you will bear with me, I'll read a little bit of a paragraph that was just so I found very empowering about that. Is that?
Oh, it's fine.
Okay. So under compassionate action, you say, the body often signals to us there's a lack of alignment between what we want to do and why we want to do it. or that what we are doing might violate our sense of morals or ethics, or that it is probably better to do nothing, or that we are serving because we have a need to be needed. Through sensing into the body, we can also learn what it feels like physically when we are going over the edge. The paralyzing tightness in the gut or chest, tension around the heart, throat, eyes, or head, jitteriness, tingling or pain, cold hands, sweating, feet moving as if we want to flee, or feeling disassociated from the body as we watch ourselves do things we don't really want to do. We may be able to rationalize our behavior in our mind, but the sinking feeling or tension in the body will give the truth away. That's one of the most powerful paragraphs that I have heard about giving people back their own sense of, where am I? What's for my higher soul purpose versus ego or personality or for somebody else. And so I love that. I really,
Thank you.
Love that. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, it's really. We have about 20 minutes left, and I feel like there are maybe some other people on the call that would like to maybe get involved. And so, hold on, before we switch though, hold on. So there's a request. Please speak more to our role and responsibility in dealing with those who inflict harm or cause suffering.
Yeah, that's a really powerful question. I think that what's very important for us to recognize that in at least our Judeo-Christian perspective, we're operating out of the dualism associated with good and evil, right and wrong. And that view, of course, is something I was brought up in. And I would say that, many of our listeners are familiar with that view. So when we see others, we're in the presence of others who cause harm to others, like when I was working in the prison system, where I worked only with people who murdered other people. It just happened that that's the unit that I worked in as a volunteer. These are pretty bad guys, if you know, good and bad. They weren't good guys. And it would be really easy for me just to keep them in the category of bad guys. But what I came to understand while spending time, which I worked inside for 6 years as a volunteer, was that the states of mind of these men who had killed other people, everything from children to their parents, that state of mind was characterized by suffering. That people who harm others, that state of mind is horrible to experience. Anger is horrible to experience. Hatred is horrible to experience. Wanting to kill somebody, to rape somebody, these are horrible states of mind, and that is suffering. And I lifted out of my conditioning to a certain extent, whatever extent I could. I lifted out of it and began to see things from a very different perspective. Instead of good and bad or right and wrong, I began to see things in terms of suffering and liberation from suffering, which is a basic Buddhist perspective. But of course, I was not brought up a Buddhist, and I don't live in the Buddhist culture. So it took, and it continues to take, a lot of work not to fall into the stance of shaming and blaming, but to be able to penetrate into the experience of others in such a way that I understand that that also is suffering. And the story of Angulimala, which I don't have time to tell the whole story, but anyway, of a serial killer at the time of the Buddha, where the Buddha, in his interaction with Angulimala, really transformed Angulimala from the violence of a serial killer into a monk and into a person of peace. And I think that part of the work that I did in the prison system was based upon, how can I not know, while at the same time, I never forgot that I was in a maximum security facility with men who had killed other people. I'm not going to be foolish about such things, but how can I drop into a place of openness and to see the truth of their state as suffering, and to also recognize that underneath their delusion, their suffering, the history of their harm of others, their self-hatred was a human heart, was humanity there. So that work really helped me change an attitude that was negatively justice-based into an attitude where it's compassionate justice, where justice is seen from the point of view of compassion, where all parties are suffering, perpetrator as well as victim. Was that helpful?
I think so. That was very powerful for sure. Just before we go to a full group, you mentioned the Judeo-Christian background. And one of the things that when I was reading your book that came up for me, I was like, and again, this is around altruism, was how many people in a lot of the Judeo-Christian religions, it's good to be a martyr. It's good to suffer if you're helping somebody else. And there's a whole thing like, oh, I'll be fine. Everybody else should go before me. Or, if I suffer, I'll get to heaven. And what a totally different reality it is, and how harmful perhaps it really is. Well, not perhaps, I would say it really is in the bigger picture. So, I think a lot of your work can help people shift that.
I mean, really, and I'm not an exemplar of this. I fall off the wagon all of the time. Mm-hmm. One does the best one can, and you cannot turn blame and harsh judgment on yourself either. I mean, that also erodes our goodness. But it is also a matter of taking responsibility and of creating the context where others feel it's safe to take responsibility for their actions that cause harm.
Yeah. So there's 2 more questions here. I'm torn because I want to begin to wrap this up so that you can get back to your life. Yeah. So I'm gonna, in fact, just because of time, I'm gonna ask these 2 questions, and then I think maybe because this is coming from the audience, so and then we'll just wrap it up with these last 2 questions. I think it's when she was talking about your conversation around maintaining compassion, and she says this perspective is challenging to maintain in the case of armies and governments that spend billions of dollars on war. Can you say more?
Well, I think one of the things that we have to be aware of is the presence of structural violence in our world, including how capitalism has is the sort of greed is the huge driving force, as is hatred and fear in our world. And this is not to say that we just sit back. I think that John Lewis, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Malala, all of these people whom we admire so much, who have worked for justice based on compassion, are living examples of individuals who have engaged in compassionate action, who have set their voice in the world in a way that has caused, Dr. King's death, Malala to be shot in the head, Mandela to be imprisoned for the majority of his life. So standing up in the name of love and justice, the combination of love, compassion, and justice, at this time, pushing back against the forces of greed, hatred, and delusion, I think we have to come together, just as women today are standing up around Me Too and saying, I have been subjected to sexual violence. I have been subjected to predation. Mm-hmm. And that kind of courage is really coming out of the ground of compassion, because if you send your voice in the world at great risk, but it protects the future.
What a
And
beautiful
that is what our world, that, you know, compassion is about. How do we protect our future, and how do we heal those who have been harmed?
What a stunning way of saying that, had to protect the future. Beautiful. So the last question, did you see an impact on the prisoner population once you shifted your stance of seeing them as suffering as well? And did that lack of judgment affect a change in the population or some of the men you interacted with?
I don't know, but it changed me.
Good answer. Okay, well, I thank you very, very, very much for your time, especially in this time of transformation and transition in your own life. May rebuilding heal well, and may you have rest and heal well. And thank you so much for being with us. Blessings to you and to your community, and to everyone who has been here today. Thank you so much for your time and being with us as well. We wish you all the best of goodness for the rest of the year. And for everyone who's going to be with us in January for the next Reaction to Response, our theme next month is mitigating human trafficking. And we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you again so much, Roshi, Joan.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing your book. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Be well, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.